Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
What is at stake for the Canada-US relationship in 2025? The political, economic, and cultural ties between our two great countries run deep. For generations, Canada and the United States have enjoyed a special relationship built on our shared history, cultures, values, and geography. But as strong as that bond is, it's not immune from disruptive and destructive forces. Though it may be often taken for granted in day-to-day life, that special connection we share with our southern neighbors is a pillar of our shared stability and prosperity. The Canada-US relationship benefits us all, every day, whether we're aware of it or not. Whether it's the free flow of goods and people between Canada and the US, the coordination of business, industry, and unimaginably complex continental supply chains, or the shared protection and promotion of the ideals at the bedrock of both our countries: liberty, democracy, and peace. The relationship we have with the geopolitical giant to our south has been integral to the development of both Canadian and American society. But like all long-term relationships, it faces tests and challenges. And the year 2025 is shaping up to be an historic one. President Trump has already pledged to use his executive powers to bring in a 25% import tariff on all goods entering America. Experts are watching closely for clues about what else the Trump administration has planned for its first 100 days. With any major disruptive policies, there are bound to be deep impacts on the Canada-US relationship. So, what's at stake?
We were supposed to be on a steady, if difficult sometimes, march towards progress. And yet, just a few weeks ago, the United States voted for a second time to not elect its first woman president.
They have a president with a strong and fresh mandate. And he's someone who is a very powerful negotiator who can spot weakness from a mile away.
And I say the most beautiful word in the entire dictionary of words is the word tariff. I love tariff. I can make anybody do anything through the use of tariffs.
I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, examining the Canada-US relationship and what's at stake in the year 2025. Joining me today is Matthew Lebo, an expert on American politics, professor of political science at Western University in London, Ontario. Hi, Professor. Thank you for taking the time.
Hello.
So, the Canada-US relationship, I'd like to start there. It's often referred to as special. It's different from the relationship that Canada has with other countries bilaterally. So what is so special about it? What is important about how our two countries interact with and deal with each other?
Yeah, it's a long list. For starters, it's the world's longest border between the two countries. There are huge cultural similarities, linguistic similarities. Many Americans living in Canada, many Canadians living in the United States, many dual citizens, people who go back and forth over the border for work, for travel, for family. We're on the same social networks. In Southern Ontario, you get Buffalo and Detroit television stations. And then trade is a huge, huge part of it. That about 2/3 of everything that is made and services that occur in Canada are then sold in the United States. And so much of what we use in Canada comes from the United States. And so the economies are intricately linked. There's long history there, political history. The two countries have fought together in world wars, in other major conflicts. Canada, of course, helped the United States and a coalition of partners in Afghanistan after the terrorist attacks in 2001. And it's just a long, long history that is just unlike any other relationship that Canada has, including our relationship with Great Britain, which of course was once our colonial power, and we're still part of the Commonwealth.
That relationship between the US and Canada, it didn't just happen overnight. It was a long process from the era of Confederation through to the second part of the 20th century. Different leaders, different personalities, different perspectives on what that US-Canada relationship ought to look like. Could you speak to that a little bit, please?
Sure. Both Canada and the United States were established as colonies. They have similar histories of taking over indigenous lands. They have similar histories of expanding westward, and they sort of grew up as nations, in different directions, but in similar time frames. So there has always been, a history since, let's say post-war of 1812, where the two countries were, gradually becoming more democratic, expanding the vote to more citizens and becoming models of democracy for other parts of the world at different paces. And again, the economic relationships have just tied the two countries together. That there are some things that Canada can just do better and on a larger scale than Americans can. And these days, a lot of that is energy. So there's been, huge changes, different kinds of leaders in the United States, Republicans and Democrats. Canada's gone through leaders. Our leadership in Canada is on let's say, a narrower ideological scale than in the United States. But we've had lots of periods where a prime minister and an American president can be of different sides of the ideological spectrum, but they're both still, commonly working towards similar international goals and working on strengthening the economic relationship between the countries.
Okay, so let's get to why we're talking today. President Trump and the Republican administration is incoming, will take office officially later this month. How would you describe President Trump's outlook, his perspective on the Canada-US relationship, and what diplomatic challenges could be in store for 2025?
There are going to be many challenges that are really difficult to predict. Donald Trump's outlook on individual countries can be very transactional. It can be based on what his feelings are towards a particular leader or his understanding or misunderstanding of how a relationship works. He doesn't really understand how tariffs work. He doesn't understand what a trade deficit is. And Canada has to somehow deal with someone who sees, threatening Canada in the way that, say, Vladimir Putin threatened Ukraine before he invaded, and sees that as something that's fun to do on social media. So it's very hard to know what he's serious about. It's very hard to see how other Republicans might hold him accountable, how his own cabinet, party, the Supreme Court might hold him accountable for doing things that, we've never seen an American president do. And his outlook towards Canada, it's very hard to say how it might be completely different under a conservative government than it is under Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. And we're, a policy of Canadian disengagement with the United States is probably, smart to think of ways that our economy can rely a little bit less on the United States. But really, we are just so closely tied that's impossible. So many things that are part of the Canadian economy just essentially rely on having good trade relationship, things going back and forth over the border so easily. And it's going to be a rocky road to see how that develops over the next 4 years.
Yeah, and on that point about figuring out what President Trump is serious about, what do you make of the social media posts suggesting that Canada ought to be the 51st states, referring to our prime minister as the governor of Canada? It was one thing, I think, when the initial joke was made, if you want to call it a joke, but there have been 3 or 4 follow-up posts to that. What do you make of those?
It is frightening. I don't think he appreciates that what he's doing is you know, provocative, that he's the only way that Canada becomes part of the United States is the same way that Vladimir Putin thinks that Ukraine becomes part of Russia. And so, to try to imagine American troops coming into Canada, like the War of 1812, it's just unimaginable. But you don't see people within his party, sort of setting him straight or talking about how, that's absolutely not going to happen. You see even people in Canada who entertain the idea like it's, there might be some good sides to it. About 10 or 15% of Canadians want to be part of the United States. That, of course, is quite different in some Western provinces. It certainly is extremely low in Quebec and among Francophone communities. And that's about the same percent of Ukrainians who want to be part of Russia. So, Donald Trump makes these statements, and they are so provocative, and he makes so many outrageous statements that it is hard to take some of them seriously. But he does wind up being serious about some of them, and he has expressed a lot of admiration for world leaders who have had territorial ambitions. He doesn't see anything wrong with that. In his first term, he didn't do anything so outrageous as to invade his closest ally or, talk too much or make anyone take seriously that he wanted to take over Greenland or the Panama Canal or parts of Mexico. But he's surrounding himself with people who will be a lot more amenable to his ideas than he did the first term, and it's all pretty scary.
From the American perspective, how does the looming Canadian election influence the approach of an incoming administration to the Canada-US relationship? It's presumed now there will be a new Canadian government within 10 months at the most of Trump taking office, fixed election date in October 2025. It's likely, some people suggest the election could happen sooner than that. So how does that change things? How does that work exactly? If you're the incoming Trump administration, do you want to spend a lot of time in meetings, forging relationships with the leaders and the staff in the Trudeau government if it looks like that government will likely be defeated sometime in the next year? How does that dynamic play out?
Yeah, Donald Trump has taken an interest in other countries' elections, and he's made known his preferences for who wins elections in other countries. He did that when he was president his first 4 years, and he will probably express some preferences for the Conservative government to win. He just generally expresses preferences for right-wing politicians, and he enjoys having an influence on other countries' elections. So I expect as a Canadian election gets closer, that he will let people know that he prefers a Conservative government to a Liberal one. The Canadian response has to be, more to deal with more than Donald Trump, to deal with people in his administration if they can, and perhaps to deal with governors, to deal with members of Congress and in the Senate who worry about what will happen to industries in their state if the trading relationship goes badly very quickly. I think that's really where the best chance of having Donald Trump held accountable is other people within the Republican Party have to see some damage coming to their constituents by following his policy, and that would be true, under a Liberal or a Conservative government. So certainly, with Donald Trump's talks about tariffs on day one, he will be dealing with the Trudeau government on day one, and perhaps we'll have an election pretty soon. Soon after that, and we'll just have to. The Canadian government, whoever is in it, will have to deal with Donald Trump, and perhaps on trade issues, there really won't be that many differences between Liberals and Conservatives as Donald Trump might expect.
Okay, that's very interesting. And on that tariff threat, can you give us some perspective on what across-the-board tariffs for imports into the U.S. would mean for the Canada-U.S. relationship? What would that mean for businesses and industries, as you say, on both sides of the border?
It's really hard to imagine again that there would be across-the-board tariffs. Donald Trump's understanding of how tariffs work and a lot of his supporters' understanding of tariffs just isn't correct. Um, the that so many things that come into the United States would become more expensive to consumers. He by making these threats, he does have he is exerting some power and perhaps is getting some of the things that he wants. So, for example, when he talks about, we're going to put a tariff on goods coming into the United States, and there's companies perhaps looking to invest in Canada, like a Volkswagen plant near London, Ontario, and then the company starts thinking, well, maybe we should actually not build that in Canada. If there's going to be a tariff, then we'll never get that stuff across the border. Maybe we should be looking to do that within the United States. And so there can be a lot of value. Perhaps Donald Trump sees the value of companies rethinking putting their investment into Canada or other countries. He's trying to draw investment into the United States. So just the threat can have value to him. But when he actually follows through on that threat, then all of a sudden he's really disrupting the trade relationship. He's disrupting prices. He talked endlessly about inflation, trying to bring inflation down. Tariffs will do the opposite. Of course, starting a trade war can often lead to actual wars. And have huge economic repercussions. And so, he might play with tariffs here or there. He might direct them at one country or another, and Canadians may see some. But as with everything with Donald Trump, it is very hard to tell what will become policy from, what he just enjoys tweeting out to make, people talk about him.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. The threat of the tariff spurs real action. We've seen the government of Canada come up with over $1 billion for border security over the next number of years, for example. So is it possible then that the utility of the threat of a tariff for Trump may be more so than an actual tariff once he takes office?
Yeah, it's possible. He can say that he's going to do something. Then he can, when something happens, whether it was going to happen or not, then he can take credit for having done so. So, there were lots of policies that he threatened to change and didn't change. But when something came along, he could say, well, when I changed the policy, things, something that was good happened because I changed it. And when something that he didn't do led to something good, then he could say, well, my threat made something good happen. And so a lot of it is bluster, but it's very hard to build policies around that. And certainly he's got the Canadian government jumping to try and make, draw his attention, say, okay, Canada's done some things, and perhaps have him focus on some other country and his trade or other aspirations with other countries.
Okay, thank you for that. To close today, the trade relationship obviously is dominating a lot of the news and the discourse. There's reason for that. A lot of money involved, $20 trillion or so. But what are some other key files you would say we should be watching that could test the Canada-U.S. relationship in the year to come?
Well, everything in terms of international relations, and especially the differences will be stronger so long as the Liberals remain in power. So the Canadian government would be much more in favor of supplying Ukraine with aid. The Canadian government is much more in favor of getting a ceasefire, keeping Israel out of Gaza, keeping Israel from annexing Gaza or the West Bank. Donald Trump is going to be completely supportive of the Israeli government and Benjamin Netanyahu and having a free hand to continue what they're doing in Gaza. And Donald Trump will probably not want to give money to Ukraine. And so as co-members of NATO, you're going to see some splits there. And it could be, Canada, along with lots of other members of NATO, especially European allies, who want to continue to support Ukraine. In Europe, especially the further east you go, the more concerned they are about what Russia goes after if they win in Ukraine. And so it's really an existential crisis for a lot of Europeans. And Canada will probably be more on their side. And that can switch when we go from a liberal government to the conservative one that's coming. And perhaps, there'll be still some major differences there. But the United States is the essential member in NATO. Donald Trump is not a fan of NATO, and the advisors that he's putting around him are not either. And that's a real difference between now and the first term. And so international relations is just a big part of this long-term relationship, and that will really be strained as well.
Well, with certainty, I can say it will be an interesting year to come, and that's about all I can say with certainty. Professor Lebo, thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed the discussion, and I know our listeners have as well. Thank you again.
You're welcome.
Again, that is Matthew Lebo, professor of political science at Western University in London, Ontario, specializing in American politics and the Canada-US relationship. That was The Big Story. Thank you so much for joining us today. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode. We love hearing from you. Just send us an email, hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm David Smith. Thank you for listening.